Hi, welcome to Chapter 4 on regulations in our pharmacology, clear and simple. Our learning objectives for this chapter are define key terms, describe the roles of the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, in patient safety, discuss how drugs are developed, and distinguish between brand, generic, and trade names, as well as know the slang names for illegal drugs, discuss why some drugs are controlled more strictly than others, give an example of a drug from each controlled substance scheduled and state its classification, discuss the roles of healthcare professionals in recognizing and reporting impaired patients and professionals. Let's start with the history of regulations. So, in the 19th century, there was Coca-Cola, and it was rumored to use the coca leaves. Regulations were created in response to toxins and elixirs, which might be contained in alcohol, morphine, heroin, opium, etc. Patients' medicine, they had remedies of questionable value that had the potential to cause harm or actually accidental death in the patients using them. Also, during the Spanish-American War, it was rumored that soldiers were being given embalmed beef, which was causing serious illness. So these things coupled together had concerns about the drug and food population or what we were taking in. And that's basically how the regulations got started as far as creating the Food and Drug Administration and the Drug Enforcement Agency. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 required accurate labeling of drugs so that the person that was consuming the drug would know exactly what was in it. And the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 was enacted more specific for regulations holding drug developers responsible for drug safety. Accurate labeling prevented substitution or misleading of ingredients, which was happening before this law in 1906. The Durham-Humphrey Amendment in 1951 was defined prescription drugs. They must be administered under supervision of a physician. So before this, that definition wasn't as detailed. So again, it defined prescription drugs. And this definition was that it must be administered under the supervision of a physician. The Kefauver-Harris Amendment of 1962 stated that advertisements must disclose risks as well as benefits. It also required drug manufacturers to show product effectiveness and safety and to report any of the adverse effects to the FDA. Thalidomide was a drug given around the world to pregnant women in the late 1950s for morning sickness. As a result, many children were born with severe deformities of the arms and legs, and therefore this law came into effect, and under it, that would have to be reported as that adverse effect to the FDA. That's an example. The Controlled Substance Act of 1970. This is when the Drug Enforcement Agency was established, and it provides the legal foundation for prevention of abuse of drugs and other substances. The Orphan Drug Act of 1983, it facilitates the development of drugs for rare diseases. Now, rare diseases are those that affect fewer than 1 in 200,000 people. And tax credits and waivers of other fees to manufacturers. So poor return on investments to produce drugs for this population. So in order to, when we have a rare disease and it only affects 1 in 200,000 or fewer, obviously then the manufacturer isn't as interested because they are not able to make the profit that they normally would. So in order to encourage this, they gave the tax credits and waivers of other fees to the manufacturer in order to have more options for the rare diseases and to develop the drugs. So the Food and Drug Administration started way back in the mid-1800s when the Bureau of Chemistry was formed to evaluate agricultural products. Then as we developed and moved on, there was the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, and the FDA then took on the regulation of medications. And in 1938, we saw the addition of the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act, and then that's when the FDA began to oversee the safe development of new drugs. So you can see kind of how the Food and Drug Administration was developed, and on the previous slide, some of the things that the DEA are responsible for as far as regulations. So let's do a comprehension checkpoint. And for this one, for fun, if you email me the answer that you think it is, you can have a virtual ticket during Tuesday's ALH 4 class. So I'm not going to give you the answer on this one, but we can talk about it very quickly on Tuesday. So the law that established more specific laws requiring drug developers to be responsible for drug safety was it A, B, C, or D? So go ahead and take a look at this slide, and then just shoot me an email or a Canvas message and tell me which one you think it is. If I receive that, I will put your name down and give you a virtual ticket. So the FDA requires that drugs be scientifically researched before they approve, and all drugs must be proven to be safe and effective. They also regulate drug distribution. So once it's approved by the Food and Drug Administration, a drug is added to the Pharmacopoeia National Formulary, the USPNF. And this is the United States Pharmacopoeia National Formulary that's comprehensive listings of all approved drugs in the United States. Any adverse reactions are to be reported to the FDA's MedWatch program, and MedWatch reporting is done using forms available on the FDA MedWatch website. The FDA approves a drug when its benefits are deemed to outweigh the risks for the intended population and use. Clinical trials. This is where they do studies that involve participants, and they're assigned to one group, either to the placebo or the control group. And from these studies, they're able to see the effects of the drugs based on that control group. And these studies are double-blind. And double-blind means that neither the participant nor the scientists know which group is getting the placebo and which group is getting the actual drug. Here you can see the phases of the clinical trials. So we have phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, and you can take a look at this in your book as well. Let's take a look at how the clinical trials work. So during the first 3 phases of the clinical trials that you saw on the slide previous, the drug is known in an investigational new drug stage, so that's the IND. If the clinical trials show safety and effectiveness, and if a therapeutic dose is established, the manufacturer then applies for FDA approval with an NDA, which is a new drug application. The approval process then can take anywhere from 6 months to several years for the FDA to do their final approval. And if it is approved, the manufacturer receives a 17 to 20-year patent on that drug. Patents allow manufacturers to recover the cost of development and to make a profit before it opens up to the possibility of becoming a generic drug. So we talked about phases 1, 2, and 3, but there's post-marketing considered phase 4 of trials. So now they can be marketed and distributed outside of the clinical trial groups. Surveillance for problems continue through MedWatch, which we talked about earlier, and they may continue to do additional research. So when we're looking at the name of drugs, we have a chemical name. And the chemical name is the first name, and it shows the mix of chemicals that are being studied. Then the brand or trade name. And this is the manufacturer that assigns the name after the drug clears the phases 1 through 3 that we talked about previously of the clinical trials. And then it's always capitalized, and many are followed by the trademark mark that you can see here. There's 2 different trademarks, here or here. So these marks indicate that no other manufacturers can use this name during the patent time. The generic name is the common name. So when a patent expires, other manufacturers may produce the medication under its generic name. Can you think of any over-the-counter, any OTC drugs like this? If you're thinking of, for example, ibuprofen and Advil, you would be correct. The first letter of the generic name is capitalized only if it begins a sentence, and the generic name is the official name. So generics must have the same active ingredients as the brand name, but different fillers. So when you look at a label, you will notice that on the label it says active ingredients and inactive ingredients. If it's a generic, it must have the same active ingredients, but the inactive ingredients can be different. So which of the following is the brand trade name in this slide? Look at that for a minute. Is it A, B, C, D, or E? If you answered E, the generic name is lowercase, ibuprofen. The trade brand name is capitalized, and the chemical name is the chemical makeup of the medication. So E, because we see Advil and Motrin. So these are both considered brand trade names. Do you see the difference there? So you could have picked Advil B or C Motrin, but both of them are actually brand trade names, so the correct answer was E. So we're still talking about the DEA again, going back to drug control. So the DEA regulates the manufacturing and distribution of narcotics, stimulants, depressants, hallucinogens, anabolic steroids, substances used in any of their production. And the Drug Enforcement Agency determines which drugs are controlled and which scheduled or categories that they fall under. We have category 1 through 5. Prescribers must register with the DEA to prescribe these drugs. So the physician has a DEA number that is included on their pharmacy pad or their pharmacy stamp if you're using electronic health records. So controlled drugs are assigned to one of 5 schedules, and we use Roman numerals to do that. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. They're based on their potential for abuse and addiction, and these drugs must be tracked. And part of tracking is making sure that all documentation is done correctly and completely. And most of these are prescription only. Let's look at Schedule 1. Schedule 1 is highly addictive. They have no accepted medical use. So heroin is a good example because it's highly addictive and we don't use that medically here in the United States. It is illegal to process, distribute, and use, and it may be used carefully in controlled research facilities only. And again, that's because it is not a drug that we currently use. So I'm going to start part 2 of the lecture, and I'll see you in a minute.